So let us start. I welcome you all very much to the second part of our global lecture series, The World in 2050. My name is Roland Benedicter. I am the UNESCO Chair here at Eurac Research in Bolzano, and we are organizing this event together with the UNESCO Chairs globally. Today's lecture, it is a real honor and pleasure, is Loes Damhof. Loes will talk to us about learning from the future, how we use futures to rethink education. This is certainly one of the most important topics, also particularly for the young generation and for the long overdue renewal of educational and schooling systems. Loes Damhof is UNESCO Chair on Futures Literacy at Hanze University of Applied Sciences in Groningen, the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And I must always underscore that she is considered a real warrior for the cause of future thinking by us peers. And this is shown also that the commitment Loes has for the cause was also shown that she was elected as Lecturer of the Year of all higher education in the Netherlands in 2016. She received the prestigious Comenius Award and dedicated it to developing future literacy pilots. In 2018, she was appointed as UNESCO Chair on Futures Literacy in the field of future studies. And she also worked and advised organizations such as Future Woman X, UNESCO, of course, the UN, FCCC, climate change forums, the United Nations, the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, and Oxfam, among many others. I must say that I consider Loes a real pioneer in the field of future studies, thinking out of the box, going beyond the limits of existing disciplinary boundaries, and proposing, maybe most important of all, lifelong courses, postgraduate courses for those who want to go deeper in the issue of future studies. So take a look at the website of Loes at Hanze University. It's one of the best, I think, and it is really worth it. And so with no further ado, dear Loes, we are looking forward to your lecture. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Roland, for this very lofty introduction, which I hope I can rise to the expectations. Welcome, everybody. I see some familiar faces, which is always nice to see, some friends, and a lot of new ones as well. So welcome to this lecture. Yes. Warrior, maybe, although I have to say that my name, Loes, stems from originally from the Dutch word that means warrior. So I don't know if you knew this, Roland, but yeah, that maybe is a little, sometimes it feels a little bit like a warrior, because if you're introducing a new capability, a new way of thinking, or even being and acting into a world that is all about planning and preparing, then it can sometimes feel a little bit like a battlefield. And being a pioneer or warrior on that battlefield, you need a good team around you and fellow soldiers. Because sometimes it feels, yeah, it can feel like you're fighting against a system. And I've always been a pioneer in higher education. I've always tried to do new things, but often a little bit in the margins. And when I received the award of Teacher of the Year, I was very, very fortunate. That's when I started working with futures. And the reason why I did that, maybe just a little bit of background on why this has been so important, it is so important to me, is that before I entered the world of future studies, I was developing 21st century skills courses. And I had the assignment from my university to really think about what are certain courses that all students need in order to be ready for the future, to be prepared. So I developed communication skills and intercultural competencies and media literacy and ethics and these courses. But there was one thing that was always missing to me, is that how can I prepare students for something that is unknown in itself? How can I prepare them for the future, where I actually think they should become comfortable with uncertainty and become comfortable with a complex world? I just didn't know if there was a capability to do that or how to do that. And when I encountered futures literacy, that somewhere clicked in my mind. And I thought, this is the capability I think all students need, and that not make the other competencies more redundant, but gives them the grounds, attitude, mindsets, capabilities to really be comfortable with what this is all about, to navigate, serve, deal, engage, relate, play, dance with an uncertain and complex world. So I've started to teach myself futures literacy, this capability. And one of the first exercises I did was to envision education in, it might have been 2050 at the time. And I realized back then, by imagining what education, what I think it would look like, but also what I want it to look like, that had fundamentally changed how I see my job and how I see my work. Because back then, when I started to imagine education in 2050, I didn't see any classrooms or campuses or buildings. I saw murmurations or clouds of people working around certain topics, being really intergenerational, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, not in a linear way of thinking, but really all about learning, that it wasn't about education at all. And that image in itself became so strong that after I had been through that process, I couldn't go back into the classroom and teach courses from 9 to 11 on a Tuesday morning. I felt I had to design my own programs where I could kind of set the parameters for students, and myself included, to learn in complexity. So that was 7 years ago now, and many years later, I still find myself again pioneering on the battleground, outside an educational system, but still inside the institution that I work with. And that sounds maybe strange that I work in an institution, but outside the system. And that is a little bit of the battlegrounds that I'm on. So what I wanted to do in this talk, I'm used to engaging with the audience. For now, I will just talk for about 25-30 minutes. But please, anything that resonates, questions you might have, feel free to write them down, post them later in the chat, because there will be plenty of time at the end for me to answer some questions, and I hope that you do. In this talk, I will first give a little bit of introduction into futures literacy, because some of you, I was told, most of you, I was told, are new to this field, especially future literacy. So for those of you who do know it, well, there's a power in repetition. and then I will talk a little bit about how we apply this to higher education. And I think that's how that can change the system as well, and where we should go, where I hope we're going in 2050. So if I'll just share my screen for now. And see if I can, it's a little bit of a mess here. Excuse me. And if you can see, yes. I started meeting Roland. See my background, I'm actually not in the future at all. I'm actually in a kind of a hut in the south of Belgium. And it feels a little bit like I'm so kind of a post-apocalypse kind of environment. But it feels maybe that is the future as well. It's all very, very sustainable environment. So I speak to you from nature and from a beautiful, sustainable hut that I hope to live in one day as well. So this is how I show up to the space. And let's talk about futures and education, or maybe even futures and learning, to speak. So I want to start with two quotes that have to do with change. And in times of change, learners inherit the earth, where the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. It's a pretty famous quote, I think, and there's a kind of a contradiction in it, because in times of change, the thing is that times are always changing. It's not just now. It feels like times are changing faster now. Sometimes it feels that times are more uncertain, more complex, but actually times have always been uncertain and times are always complex. It just feels like there's a sense of urgency now to the times that we live in. And one of the reasons, of course, is the current crisis that we're going through that are might not have predicted them, but they are, some of them we might have predicted, but in any case, the crisis that we're going through now are challenging our assumptions about what we thought would continue and what we thought would discontinue. So it feels that times are changing faster and more rapidly or more intensively or with bigger consequences, but that's actually just gives us information on the assumptions that we used to have. Another quote that I want to put out there is from a book that I love deeply. It's The Parable of the Sower, with Octavia Butler. Some of you might know it. And it was published in the 70s, and it's about a dystopian Los Angeles in 2025. It's eerily familiar to the situation now. But it is about a young girl that starts a new kind of religion or community around religion, but has nothing to do about worshiping a god, but about worshiping change. And the quote here is from the book that she's writing: "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change." So if things are changing constantly, and if that's the only constant, how in higher education or in education in general, how do we relate to change? Isn't that the competency, the skill, the mindset that we need to develop if we want to deal with everything else? Is that the constant that we need to relate ourselves to? So how do we do that? And you won't be able to answer this, but I often start lecturing by asking a very simple question, just to get your mind a little bit into future thinking. So what if you wake up in 2050 and in a post-normal world that you do not understand? And you can ask one question to make sense of the world around you. That question can only be answered with yes or no. What would you ask? Now, just think for yourself for a minute. And you might have very different questions. It might be, am I safe? Are there still schools? Do we still have money? Are there still borders? What about my family? Can I have a cup of coffee? These questions, and think about it for yourself, they have a lot of data in itself. So it's not as interesting about whether it's the right question or it's not a good question. The question itself, what you envision in 2050 to be, gives us a lot of data or information where you are at the moment. So if the question that you want to ask is about safety, it's about climate change, or is it about you or your personal development, it is a reflection of where you are in the present. And it gives us data about where we are, but also the assumptions that we have about the future. And basically, futures literacy, the work that we do, is not about the future at all. It's very much about the present, about the assumptions that we have. So in my chair, we don't study futures. We study how people think about the futures, because that gives us data about the assumptions that we have the convictions that we have, the things that we take for granted, and the things that are very important to us. So just maybe you want to go back. It would be nice at the end, if you allow to enter the chat, to post some of your questions. So the chair that I'm a part of, we have a team, which is also quite unusual. A lot of UNESCO chairs are often one professor that does fundamental research or does research that is about the goals or contribute to the goals of UNESCO. In our case, we are a team of 6. And we just got our second chair renewed late 2022. So chairs for about 4 years. And the first 4 years we really used to discover what future literacy was, what it meant. We developed courses, future literacy laboratories. We got a lot of data out of that, those workshops and training programs. And we always try to apply that in society and beyond. And we looked at the design principles and the impact of what it did to students. And I'm happy to see that I saw some familiar faces in this audience that were part of that program, some of those programs as well. In the next 4 years, in this 4 years, so the second one, we talk about what are other ways to imagine the future. Where a lot of the work that we do around futures is very verbal, it's very cognitive. So we talk about it, we make it explicit. And now we're looking at other ways to imagine futures. And one of the work that I do is with museums. How can we also use the public space to imagine futures, to use them as a facilitator to challenge our assumptions? What is the relationship to learning and complexity? That's some of the projects that we are involved in. We believe that in order to relate ourselves to complex worlds, we need a paradigm shift and a different way, also a different concept of knowledge creation, a different way of thinking about how we create knowledge, how we learn. So how does that really work? How can futures literacy contribute to learning and complexity in complex situations? And what are some of the research methodologies that support anticipation for emergence? So a lot of research methodologies, can we still use those to study how we study emergence, how we study anticipations? How do we study research something that is so emergent, that is so constantly adapting to change, that pop up? How does these former methodologies still apply to what we are trying to do? And one of the things is about impact. So can you really measure the impact of future thinking, and are some of the tools still relevant? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but let's first dive a little bit into a short introduction of what future literacy is for those who don't know. It's a capability of imagining multiple and diverse futures. And that's really important to understand, that we often talk about the future like there is only one. But there are about 50 people in this call. That means that there are at least 50 futures right now in our mindset. But if I would introduce a new topic or a different topic, or you would get into a conversation with somebody else who would share a different future, another future pops up. So there are already multiple futures just in this Zoom call. And yet we talk about it like there is only one, which is problematic, because the question arises then, whose future is it if there's only one? So there are just as many people, just as many futures as there are people, and a lot more. And it's a porous thing. Futures change. They're fluid. You might see something, read something, and another future image pops up. But we're not always very good at it. We're not very good at imagining futures. It's difficult for us to imagine something that's not there. And we're also not very skilled in making them very explicit. We rarely talk about our different futures images. We talk about the future as there's one. So how can we stretch our imagination and go beyond those first, the boundaries of that? And that practice of imagining multiple futures and using those future images to see the present anew. So go back to the present and look with a fresh pair of eyes and make better informed decisions. I said earlier, when I asked that question, you wake up in 2050, that is, and then look at your question, that is using the future. You're using a future image. And I think, hey, this tells me something about what I find important now. So that is using the future, like a pen, your phone, or a notebook, or something like that. You're using future images to better understand the present, but also to see new things, to become aware. So that's the capability. And that's, I'll get a little bit more into that now. Like I said, the future is unknown and uncertain in itself. There's nothing, I don't think I say something very shocking in its sense, but we also, the idea of what it is that it's every second, every hour, every week, every year that is later than now. So that's the beyond the now. That is what we call the future. That is unknown and uncertain in itself. And yet how we talk about it is from an idea that we can know it, especially in higher education. If we talk about preparing students for something that is unknown and uncertain, what is that we actually are doing? Are we trying to eliminate that uncertainty by planning and preparing, or are we preparing them to deal with that uncertainty itself? So there's in this wide, this range of series of future studies, future literacy takes a specific spot. Now, like I said, I entered this field through future literacy, the capability itself, but it has a spot in this big tent of how we use futures. And in the series of talks that come beyond or after me, you will hear a lot of different ways of what we call the discipline of anticipation that we are striving towards. So all of these, whether it's foresight, scenario planning, speculative design, forecasting, futuring, etc., these are all ways to use the future and to really understand better, how do we anticipate? How does it change the present? How does these processes work? How does these systems work? What happens if we do? How does that can help us become better learners in complexity? So all of these big tents were all basically warriors on the same battlefield, as Roland was saying. So what makes future literacy different is the fact that it's a capability and that it incorporates this idea of anticipation for emergence. So a lot of the times in futures work, we tend to look at it, hey, where is it, where are we going? Where do we want to go? Where do we think we're going? But in a sense, can we also use those and to be more alert and more open in the now? And I'll get a little bit more into that now. So the discipline we anticipate all the time as humans, but also as if I take my dog for a walk, and the moment he realizes we're going to his favorite playground, he almost chokes himself with anticipation for going to that specific spot. So a lot of, living organisms, we anticipate, we imagine different situations beyond the now. So let's see if we can find ways to study a little bit. What does that really mean and how does it change? Because if we do, it changes the present. The moment I start anticipating something different, I act upon it. I do, whether I think it's going to rain, whether my dog smells we're going to a certain place, it changes his behavior in the present. And so that happens, that counts for all of us. So how do we often use anticipation? And I'm going to focus a little bit on education. For the educators among us, if you teach, you plan. You plan your lessons, you plan your curriculum, you plan, you set goals for students to learn, their learning objectives, and you work towards those objectives with the students. So thinking that, hey, if we're planning for a test, this is what I want to do, I want to get to that goal. Everything in higher education, let me speak for my institution, is based on the idea that we need to plan to optimize the results. We want to get good students, good results, good grades. We want them to leave with a good skill sets, enter the world, etc. So we plan all the time. We set a goal and we work towards that. Yeah. Another way to deal with the future is to prepare. So we also prepare students for maybe a change in job markets, new developments and trends on the horizon. So we're thinking, this is where we think the job market or the world looks like in 4 or 5 years when they graduate. So how do we prepare them the best? So preparation is another way to use futures in order to make decisions and etc. You see a picture of me here, clearly being prepared a little bit, wearing hiking boots and having a map, but clearly not completely prepared for this kind of weather in a snowstorm, and trying to kind of make my way. So I'm a little bit lost. I'm not quite sure where to go, but I'm wearing the right gear, so I was prepared for what was coming. Now, planning and preparation are very common ways to use the future in general, but in higher education, it's basically all that we do. We also know that things happen unexpectedly. We cannot prepare ourselves for anything. We cannot eliminate uncertainty. We certainly cannot prepare for all contingency or eventualities. So what do we do with that part that is uncertain and complex in itself? That is when we introduce anticipation for the unknown. How do we use future for the unexpected road? How do we use futures to be comfortable, not in order to plan or prepare better, but just to get a sense of, hey, I feel confident enough that whatever the universe is throwing at me, I will not get too phased, or I feel confident enough that I realize all that is happening is that my assumptions are being challenged. But not only that, can I also become so comfortable that I can observe change and observe emergence and see new things around me that are outside of the spectrum of planning and preparation? Can I use future? Can I stretch my imagination so big that so far that whenever I look around in the present, I see new things. I see change, and it does not shake me that much. All I know is that there are things that I did not plan or prepare for. Can I be alert? So it's either be comfortable with unexpected events, but also be more alert on the lookout. Can I see the technology? Navigating between those 3 systems, we call them anticipatory systems. Navigating between those, it makes you futures literate. So understanding, when do I use planning, preparation, when do I explore multiple futures, so I can become more comfortable with uncertainty. If you can do that, that's a really good start. But of course, it doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen within this half an hour. So it takes practice, it takes nurturing this kind of skill. And the exploration of futures is what we do in a lot of our courses in future literacy. Really push the imagination, push the boundaries. I'm going to move a little bit. Okay. So all futures are based on assumptions. And the moment we start to think about future, we make an assumption about that. And that's just because it doesn't exist. So that's all we can do. Yeah. Now, there are a couple of, just to give you some examples of some of the assumptions that we are making. Now, if we say that it's going to rain tomorrow, that's not, if we make that assumption, it turns not to be true. That's not a huge problem. We take an umbrella or we don't, that's fine. It's not going to have a huge kind of impact. But if we say that education will become entirely personalized and digital, that's a prediction that's a lot of my colleagues make at my university that can have huge implications on the decision that we're making. And it's based on what exactly? Is it based on what we think? Is it based on somebody's agenda? Where is it going? And the question is that what we want? Oh, sorry. Another one is, and then I quote, go back to the quote in the beginning, that change is the only certainty. Now, if you look at those kind of future images, predictions, they're all based on assumptions, but they're different. One is very practical, it's short term. The other one is more maybe based on an agenda, it's more long term, has larger implications or impact. And the third one is maybe a little bit more philosophical, kind of more of a mindset. So whenever we think about the future, we make an assumption, but sometimes we treat them like with the same certainty. We say, oh, but education will become very online, digital, with the same certainty as we say it's going to rain tomorrow. And understanding the difference in level where they are, that's a part of future literacy, understanding and using futures in a different way. So how do we do that? It's important to understand by using futures is that there are a lot of underlying, I already said, agendas and stories and myths and convictions every time we make an assumption. And sometimes it's very useful to look at like, hey, if we put a future vision out there, what do we see when we imagine? What is it something, a vision that we see that is very clear, that it's just out there? But what are some of the systems that are in place that are underneath that vision? And what are our underlying values and convictions and agenda? Just to get a sense of, hey, can I challenge those or not? Should I challenge those underlying ideas, etc.? And I just want to refer, it comes to education, to use this quote. It's a Nigerian proverb, and I like to use those a lot. And it says, unless the lion learns how to speak, the hunting story will always glorify the hunter. And the reason why I use this quote is that if we feel that something needs to be taught, we often think, and it's happening in my institution now as well, is that our first response is saying that, oh, we need another perspective to this story. So let's teach the lion how to speak. Well, we actually might want to investigate the underlying story at all. Is this the narrative that we want to use? Why is the hunting story so incredibly important? So instead of teaching the lion a human capability, can we really talk about the story, the narrative in itself? Can we change narrative? Now, if we want to change a narrative, an underlying story about where we want the future, what kind of future do we want to be a part of, then we need to go a lot deeper underneath the surface. And we need to challenge the status quo and look at those deep-rooted narratives that are based on values, convictions, agendas, etc. And that takes a lot of imagination. So if we look at futures and, in my case, higher education, the problem is that higher education is designed with a supposition that what needs to be learned is knowable in advance. And of course, we know that is not true. So a lot of programs are developed with the idea to eliminate uncertainty and to make sure that students are ready for the future. But that cannot be, you can only prepare yourself so much. There's always a need for uncertainty. So how do we do that in an educational system? And where do we need to go to work towards 2050, where all students are not just, yes, they know when to plan and prepare, but they also are extremely comfortable in complexity and uncertainty. So instead of planning and preparing our students and ourselves, this is what I think we should do. We should really look at education institutions as an idea that can they be futures literate as an institution itself. It's just not, and just teaching students a capability is not enough. It's really difficult to teach students to be open for emergence in certain classes and programs in a certain curriculum. If the teachers do not know how to use futures in their own work, then it will be really hard to teach students within a very set reframe. And not only teachers should be futures literate, the team leaders, the deans, the executive board, the institutions as a whole, the supportive support systems, etc. The whole system or institution should make space for the unexpected and for emergence. How do we incorporate a mindset into curriculum? Because teaching a course, developing a course, not just enough. I do it, but it's now we are working within the chair to really see how can we, throughout a whole curriculum, constantly make space and ask underlying fundamental questions using futures images. just to develop one course about future studies, then we are studying the future, but we're not incorporating the capability itself. And that is crucial. How do we challenge the status quo? If we really want an educational system and our institutions to be more open for uncertainty, how do we challenge the underlying deeply rooted stories underneath the water surface that are based on convictions and norms and values and ideas? Because just innovating our educational practices is not enough. We can come up with new ways to teach and new tools and great online cool things and gadgets, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a fundamental different shift in how we learn, because we need to understand we cannot prepare or plan our way out of everything. We need to embody and incorporate uncertainty and complexity into our educational systems and institutions. So just innovating is not enough. We need to go to the root of the story and challenge the narrative, the story itself. And that's not easy. That requires a lot of, requires first of all an understanding of what complexity is. I'm also looking at the time a little bit, is that because there are different levels of problems and challenges that we face. And sometimes we see the challenge that our students face as a simple one, oh, let's just let's like making coffee. And but it's important to understand that there's a difference between complexity and a complicated problem, right? Complicated problem can be like rocket science, the outcome is defined, criteria. It's still very, very difficult, but there is a manual of way how to do things. There are rules, protocols, and often guidelines. Now, complex challenges or issues or complexity in itself, the certain outcome cannot be defined. So think about raising a child. There's no cookbook, there's no protocol, cannot be reproduced. Everybody who maybe has a sibling, you're raised by the same parents, maybe same circumstances, but they're completely different outcomes or different people, obviously. So understanding that the world is issues that we face and challenges are complex. How is education responding to it? Often through looking at it like they're simple or complicated problems and challenges. And that is the problem in itself. So how we respond to that problem becomes part of it. So what do we need? What is a challenge for learning if the world is complex and we want to prepare, or we want students to be comfortable with that? Is that we really need to look at knowledge creation in itself. And this is one of the areas that my chair is working on. And instead of, just transferring knowledge from teacher to students, or applying to practice or individual learning or formal kind of learning, we really need to move towards an idea of becoming in learning and personal developments, integrating ways of knowing, acting, and being, and understanding that how we learn is often related to others. It's individual and collective learning, and also an engaged formal and informal learning. And a lot of the spaces in future literacy that we use, we try to put this into practice. So really, instead of saying, hey, this is a set of rules, we create kind of the safe space where we explore futures and really understand, hey, what are different ways of doing? Can we challenge, again, that narrative? Can we challenge the status quo? And that's where education is, what I hope, is moving towards. And future literacy is a skill to do that. So this is a little one of the projects that we're looking into. And I know I have to move a little bit faster. Is that a complexity-oriented learning approach? So really shifting from thinking that knowledge it's moving towards something, there's a problem to be solved, a very linear way of thinking. We need to understand that things happen constantly, that complexity is just a given. And how can we facilitate our learning in that way? And future literacy is an incredibly important skill to do that. It's always situative, it has roots in practice, and it's an appreciation of complexity. And we put in there becoming as well, and epistemic literacy as well, which is really understanding how and how we learn, how we create knowledge. And this really is a different concept of knowledge creation that is lying underneath that we need to understand. And currently we are developing courses, sounds very linear, but still developing spaces where students can practice in becoming epistemic literacy and future literacy. Now, one of the programs that we are developing and the learning objectives that we've developed for future literacy that really help to become comfortable in those complex environments are that through futures literacy, we enhance our perception. We tend to embrace complexity, not just deal with it, be ready, but actually really appreciate it. To enhance perception, to see more in the present, embrace complexity, and create some kind of new sense of agency. So can we, like I said in the beginning, instead of be comfortable with complexity, also be alert? Can we also see new ways of doing and new being that impacts our acting? Can we be aware of that? So those are 3 learning outcomes of future literacy that we need in a complex world. If we, not if, but I think we do, to just engage differently with the world around us. I have a few quotes here, but I'm going to skip through them. So a few of the takeaways from this talk that I hope you'll remember is that it is proclaimed by UNESCO as the capability of the 21st century. Why? Because it encompasses almost everything. It helps us to open up with the complexity, global societal challenges, it is critical thinking, it is collective learning, it's individual learning, and it really underneath everything, it is really explores new ways of doing, thinking, and being. Another way takeaway is that how we think, how we anticipate matters, right? Imagining multiple futures can help us to become aware, and that changes the present. So we're using that specific skill to really challenge us, the status quo, present dominant narratives. And that's what we need, because how we're doing things right now it's probably not going to cut it. We often plan in education to prepare and eliminate uncertainty, and exploring alternatives can help us to be more open for new ways and for emergence. And this is very important for me, it's empowers. It's a skill that's, and just by the fact that you're putting another future image next to something is an act of hope. It doesn't have to be a hopeful future per se, but the fact that we can push the boundaries of our imagination, that can be empowering in itself. And it has empowered me. When I started this and I imagined education in 2050, the image that I had empowered me and gave me an idea. Hey, I do not have to follow someone else's plans. I do not have to follow someone else's idea. I can actually put another image next to this. And that has empowered me as a teacher to start developing myself in this work. And has opened my own eyes and see a lot of the novelty, a lot of the emerging things in this field, and have strengthened me and empowered me as a warrior to continue to develop and to design learning spaces that I thought really contribute to meaningful learning and to be comfortable in that complexity. So it has really empowered me, and that's what I think, that's where we're going. So the world in 2050, what it looks like, I can only imagine, we don't know. But I think we would move towards spaces where we're feeling comfortable, confident enough to explore new ways of doing, to challenge the status quo, not be afraid, but really act out of hope. So that's my hope for the future. And that's by the end of my talk. And I hope I still have a few minutes for questioning.
There will certainly be questions. Thank you, Loes. That was really a beautiful introduction in one of the most important fields, which is how can we deal with futures at all, and how should we challenge our assumptions? How can we broaden our access to potential futures? and how can we ourselves develop in approaching potential futures. And I think you gave us a beautifully put insight in an emerging field where you are pioneer, really, and which deserves to be expanded, especially because it is also connected to inter and transdisciplinary as the new need to approach the big, as you said, complex problems in the world. We cannot approach them just via traditional disciplines, but we have to break out of the boundaries that academia and higher education has provided us successfully for over the past years. The problems are more complex, are more interrelated. So I think we are on the right path here to try something new, and to some extent, futures literacy, as you have presented us to us, is also to some extent experimental. It is breaking the barriers. It is going into the uncharted territory, and that makes it an adventure, which perhaps needs a barrier to a certain extent, but where also normal people can participate. Now, that said, I thank you again, Loes, for this brilliant introduction. We have certainly a couple of questions, and I would be happy to read them to you. First, there is Eva Maria Spreitzer from Switzerland, who is herself an expert in facilitating future literacy.
Yeah, I know Eva Maria.
Yeah, I know her. She's well established, although very young. She writes, "Thank you, Loes. Love the way you frame the work you do of being with an institution, but outside the system when practicing and teaching futures literacy. Kind of an act of subversive action towards systemic change, I think." I don't know if you agree, but I also felt that there is a kind of, let's say, resistance or resilience against systemic pressure, and a huge sense of freedom in what you presented, of deconstructing assumption and breaking free of what you already know.
Yeah. Thank you, Eva Maria. First of all, that's being with an institution but outside the system. Yeah, I agree. Although I have to say, I'm always a little bit resistant towards the idea of the Trojan horse, right? That I'll move into the system and I really, why I say this is that I always tend to be very transparent about where I want to go, even within the institution. And I think that's really important. I don't really believe in a Trojan horse strategy. Yes, I want to change the system. I also want to change the institution with it. But I think that the institution can also be kind of a home or a safe space where you can play with the boundaries of the system itself. And sometimes by doing that, you can show the institution that, hey, a lot of the changes that you want are on an organizational level, but what about the systemic level? So playing with that, it feels like a dichotomy. How can you be within an institution but outside of a system? But I don't think it is. I think I see the institution as my home base. Within that, I play with the systemic boundaries that a lot of people think are the same. That, oh, but I work here and I cannot change anything. But that's often an assumption as well. So if you challenge that, that gives you a lot of freedom. But I have to say, when I started pioneering in higher education, I was always very vocal and very, almost, I wouldn't say aggressive, but assertive. Like, oh, we need to change and come on, do it. And I come to understand that innovation doesn't start with persuasion. It starts with an invitation. The harder, the louder I shout, the less I would accomplish or play with people. And I think it's, coming from kind of a humility or humbleness to say that, hey, there are other ways of doing. Let's play. These are my assumptions. What about yours? And I think it's really about creating safe spaces. And you can use even walls of a classroom can be a safe space. It's not about, those are just the constructs, but what happens in between, you can go beyond the systems. So systemic boundaries. So that's some of the things I've learned as a warrior, that if you use the language, war-like language, that doesn't always get you very far. So yes, a warrior, but a very kind and hopefully humble one.
Great. Another question comes from Alison Heritage, and it reads, regarding examining how we think about the future, our relationship with the future is emotional. After a collective traumatic event, the desire for many is to move on, forget, and with this our anticipation of the future changes. Is there value in examining memories of the future? It as the futures we have forgotten.
Yeah.
Sounds like a quite complex question in itself.
Oh no, I mean, yeah, but that's good. Yeah, I think it's Soha and Ayatollah calls it used futures, but maybe someone else. But I think this idea that your the future images, the memories of the future that we had, yeah, that can be traumatic. I mean, think about climate change. Yeah? The idea that everything would just become better, or there's a war in the European continent, or all the things that we thought would improve, democracy, women's rights, that we had this assumption that things would continue, that futures would be brighter. And all of a sudden we have to deal with the fact that that's not the case at all. That can be traumatic. And for every transformation, and I think we are in transformative period, we are in transition, that requires grief, and it also requires time to grieve. And there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, I think we should take time to really think about it. So the question is not, oh my gosh, how did we get here now? The question should be, why did we think we never thought we would get here? What were we assuming that we would never get here in this place? So in every times of transition, we need to let go of certain things in order to make space for new things. And that's, if we do not take the time to grieve, understand our thinking from the past, I think the risk of making the same mistakes again, getting stuck in the same narrative, are just getting larger. So I completely agree with Andre, what's his name? Alison, yes.
Yeah, that reminds me what Eva Maria brought up last time when she spoke, that we need to add to the sustainable development goals, the so-called inner development goals, which is quite interesting concept in my view. So a kind of spirituality that I feel also inbuilt in this approach that you are pursuing and we are pursuing with Futures Literacy. Next question by Ted Fuller.
Hi, Ted.
We know well. Is change a certainty? Is persistence becoming an uncertainty?
I don't know if it's nice one, Ted. Yeah, I think things are always changing, and for me, I've come to look at change differently. It's because I think that we now live on the assumption that things only change if we change something. But I think that's not true. And I've used this example before, is that every morning I go swimming at the same place in the river, in cold water throughout the whole year, every morning, and in cold water. And I feel, because I do that, I can feel the temperature change in 1 degree, 2 degrees, hotter, warmer, colder. And I change I see the different birds, I see, and that whole immersive experience of stepping into that water and feeling change has really opened my eyes on a change, that sometimes we need repetition or standing still to be able to observe change. And I think we've lost that capacity a little bit. We think that, we need change, we need to change something. But if we only think about that like that, we also come to realize that everybody wants change, nobody wants to change. And sometimes there's a power in repetition and slowing down to observe change as well. And then you'll see that things are always changing constantly. And coming back to Ted's question, is persistence becoming an uncertainty? No, I think there's a beauty in, sometimes we need persistence, we need discipline in order to improvise. We need persistence in order to observe change. So I don't think that's either or. I think they are like the yin and the yang, they go together. But I do think there's that Persistence is not bad, but if you are aware that you are becoming too attached to one scenario, that involves a certain kind of risk. If you're not willing to let go, if you're not willing to examine your own assumptions, why you are holding on to a certain scenario, of why is that persistent there, what assumptions are you making, then, but you're just holding on to it out of fear, then it becomes a risk. So it's playing with that and understanding why am I persistent? Why am I holding on to this? I don't know if that's an answer to that question or comments, but it's the answer that I have.
Well, so we are closing steadily in to the end of our time. A last question maybe by Gustav Wollens. Thank you for an inspiring talk. Could you explain a bit more the project you mentioned in which you are working, Futures Literacy, in the context of museums and museum spaces? Yeah. Or did I understand you correctly?
Yes, Gustav, thank you very much. Yes, you did. Very briefly, I'm in the steering committee of this network called Forums, Futures-Oriented Museums Synergies. And that's about future, so the museums that work with the future. And as you might know, that museums are institutions that are under, well, they also need to change. Whether you're a history museum, a science museum, or a future-oriented museums, we are really questioning, hey, what story is being told within museums? So, and there are certain future-oriented museums that are showing images of the future. Now, in history museums shows images of the past, of history, and telling, hey, this is what happened. But that's often very limited because they're all curated, right? So museums in itself need to rethink their own stories, and also we need to rethink their own role in society. And that's what I'm helping them with. So I'm also helping them to use futures to question their own roles and how they show up. But what I also do now is work within the space of museums themselves. So if people enter a future-oriented museum, can we use the space in the museum to question people's assumptions? Can they become active participants in that space with society? Can they, instead of going to a museum to look for information, they go to a museum to look for more questions or to question more. And that's, so now I'm working with Futurium in Berlin, Science Museum in Amsterdam, NEMO, but also the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro. Can we use the public space for people to question assumptions about technology, about learning, about science? And hopefully, I'm experimenting with that now, use the public space, maybe move it to public space in general, like a train. Can we use the public space of a train station to design, use arts, images, installations to help people question assumptions about mobility? Can we use the waiting room of a hospital and use arts and images to help people question their assumptions about health in society? So that's a new field that I'm super excited to be part of. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we all love the anticipatory fluid energy that you emanate, Loes, because you can really feel the experimental character. And this is also what the colleague of that Fuller Carolina mentions and notes when she writes, you're still developing an underlying coherent philosophy, but by using a brilliant fluency of developing concepts. So this character of fluid creation also of anticipatory concepts is, in my view, the most inspiring thing that I perceive. We have a very final question, Loes, if you allow me to do so, because it came in and I think it's very, very interesting, but this is really the last one, by Leo Mendel Rosario. If there are multiple futures, how can we decide in which action to take? Do we prepare for all the possible scenarios and eliminate as time goes by?
You can do that, but you can, of course, scenario planning is a brilliant example of that. And you can, but how many scenarios do you need? I mean, is 8 enough? 12, 24, 1, 3? The thing is that because it is the future is uncertain, unknown, unknowable in advance, there will never be enough scenarios, because you can develop 10 scenarios. But my mom always says, yeah, 10 scenarios, but then a scenario number 11 is going to happen, right? I mean, that's not. So the thing is not about, do I develop enough scenarios and do I tick them off as time goes by? I think the idea behind this is that by developing these scenarios, you stretch your imagination muscle, and you become more resilient in itself. And it's not about ticking off the boxes or this scenario will happen, but by practicing that and by pushing the boundaries, you become more creative, resilient, and open for new things in itself. And you become more confident. Like I said, just by, if you're able to imagine multiple scenarios, that in itself creates kind of a hope and kind of a resilient attitude. And whatever if scenario number 11 happens, you'll see that it will be easier, or just you have more confidence to respond and act to it. So this is, yes, it's good to develop, it's fine to develop scenario, to plan for it, to prepare for it, but it's not enough. You need to be open for uncertainty as well. And it's not either or, you need all of it to understand all of it. So even if you plan for 10 scenarios, that in itself will give you the mental leniency to respond, to take advantage of, to dance the scenario number 11. And that is very hopeful and empowering in itself. So those are my final words, I would say. Yeah.
Yes, this is a good final word because it ends on a note of hope.
Yes.
Which is quite important in the present situation of the global process. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
It was a very precious input. And to all who have followed us, thank you for participating. Please drop by next time on the 14th of March. We have Roberto Poli, the UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Systems of the University of Trento, and he will basically continue this discourse talking about future studies used by whom, why, and how. Yes. So thank you all for participating, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.